These are the daffodils we're painting. I'm using my Pentalic Aqua journal. Love the heavyweight paper. Here's a quick sketch. Only took me a couple minutes. I sped it up for you. I'm using Cadmium Yellow for the center cone of the flowers, and I'm going to vary that with some Azo Yellow. You notice I have the two different yellows. I'm going to use Azo Yellow on the petals. Azo Yellow is a very translucent yellow. It has a very slight green tint to it, and Cadmium Yellow is an orangey reddish yellow. So it's very opaque. So the contrast between those two yellows makes it absolutely fantastic. You see how it's very light. You already can tell the difference. Just barely starting to dry. This entire painting took 30 minutes to do. I'm doing both sides of my sketchbook, so there was a bit of I was only going to do one side, and I couldn't resist doing the second, so it took a little bit longer that way. I love daffodil season, and yes, there are bugs outside. It's actual spring weather in February. Daffodils, I have hundreds of daffodils, maybe 1,000, and they're all these old-fashioned varieties that bloom at odd times and smell wonderful. So I hate the modern ones that don't smell at all. Now see how the opaque cadmium yellow, and you're seeing the difference even more as it dries. I added a little bit of Cobalt Teal to Azo Yellow, so you get the green tinge of the petals. I'm working with a very limited palette today. All I'm using is Cobalt Teal, Azo Yellow, Cad Yellow, and Cobalt Violet, and then a bare tinge at the end of quinacridone rust. So that's only 5 pigments, and they are all single pigment colors that I'm using. Very limited palette. All the spring flowers are so delicate, and usually something like this I would paint in several layers inside of my studio, but outside you're wanting to go ahead and paint, right? And you don't want to wait around, because you can tell from the light on the piece of the paper it's already changing. So I'm out there for half an hour and the light changes constantly. So I don't want to wait. I can't wait, because I want to paint them with backlit wonderfully how I see them. So that means very intense washes, more intense than I would do in a studio, and get that paint on there and move with it. But if you use a lot of colors that way, not a great idea. I always recommend beginners especially only do 3 colors in a wash. So this is mostly 4 colors. And that's it. If I get any more, it's fussy. See that wonderful backlighting? So now I couldn't resist. I had to wait a second because the left side of the page was absolutely sopping wet. So now I'm painting the right side, and I'm going right in with some harsh cadmium yellow. And you can see the little yarrow leaves coming up from the shadow. And the shadows are already moving. And here you can really see the greenish tinge, and that is not Azo Yellow that I've added green to, and not cadmium yellow that I've added red to. It's just the natural colors. Very different colors. And it seems kind of a waste to have 2 yellows on my palette, but obviously one's better for mixing some things and the other is better for mixing other things. And you really need both with the daffodils. Now notice how I'm leaving lots of whites in here. I'm not wanting to use opaque white if I can possibly help it in this sketch, because it's such a light painting, and it really is all about the opaque transparent contrast between the 2 yellows, And if I start adding an opaque white in there, it's going to get very heavy looking. And I don't want that. So lots of light. Notice where the striations in the petals are and let your brush follow those along. So Cobalt Teal pre-mixed with a lot of Azo Yellow and splatter painting away. Remember, this is a very light sketch. I'm not wanting a lot of detail or a lot of contrast in anything. So I do want lots of splatter paint because that makes it fun. And there's some casualties. So you can see the 2 pages here. So I'm going in with a second layer where it's dried on the first page, and you can see it's still pretty wet. It would still count as, if you're limiting to 3 colors, it still counts here as 1 wash because everything's still wet from the first wash. But there's just enough dried where I can get kind of a second layer where it blurs in and out of the first layer. I'm going to blend some of the leaves in with the petals, especially the petals, because petals, there's this one daffodil that's turned away and it's particularly noticeable. You can see how you can see the greens right through it. It's a very greenish tinge. A little bit more detail, and deep in the center cone, some light, some of the same greens. You see the pale yellow green, and you also see some shadows. So I did those with cobalt violet in a minute, but started off with the very light pale greenish tinge to give some depth to the cone shape. I wish y'all could see this because it's just spectacular. I don't think we've ever had this gorgeous daffodil year. It's amazing. It's a very early spring, and so all the different varieties are all blooming at once when it usually stretches over several months, and now it's over a couple weeks and everything is blooming. See a little bit more of the cobalt teal in there. We got most of these daffodils from my husband's grandparents when they moved out, and they had been there 60 years. So very old varieties there, and a friend of ours collected ones from old homesteads, and we've collected ones from old homesteads, you know, when the bulldozer's sitting right there and the daffodils are gone. Okay, so the cobalt violet pushes, it gives me that depth, but it goes on a whole lot darker than it will dry. So it's going to just be a very subtle shadow in there instead of, you know, let's just slap on some burnt sienna or something. Very subtle and a lot of granulations in there, which is perfect for flower petals. And you notice I just have my little setup here. I've got 12 colors. Sometimes I wish I had 1 or 2 more, but usually the 12 will do me for just about any outdoor, plein air, quick project. I bring my big palette if I'm going on a big painting expedition, but I don't do that too often anymore because I watch my 4-year-old. And that's, you know, painting on location is a concentrating thing. So these are just little plein air sketches, and you don't need very much to do that. Couple colors, 2 brushes, a rigger and number 14. round. Any kind of, I really like the pointed squirrel hair, seems to be the most versatile. And a 12 or 14 size, I think, is also the most versatile for a 5 inch by 8 inch sketchbook like I'm using here. If you have a smaller sketchbook, you might want a slightly smaller brush, but I really wouldn't go below a number 10. So it may seem like that it's a clunky one to use, but practice those brush stroke exercises and everything that I've had up there before, and you'll find out that you have the most control with the bigger brush. You can go from the tiny little hairline, to a really huge wash, all in the same stroke. So blurring some of the petals down into the background. Some more Cobalt Teal with a little bit of the yellow in there. Sorry about the two brushes at once. I wanted you to see the paints and the limited palette, but it's hard to match them up once you've chopped them up. So remember that Cobalt Violet is going to dry a lot lighter, and as it mixes with both yellows, it's going to give you some very interesting granulations. And notice how the shadows are changing already. When I started this, and the entire painting, including a drying time and running to fetch glasses of water for kids and all that kind of thing, it took 30 minutes. So light changes quickly, which is why I always recommend take a picture of what inspired you from the start. And even if a lot of subtle light things you cannot capture with a picture, it just doesn't work, no matter how good your camera is. Cameras are good for bold images, not subtle ones, but it will still remind you of what you saw. Okay, so this is Cobalt Teal mixed with the Cobalt Violet to dull it. So it ends up being a weird, chalky, sort of bluey gray, which daffodil leaves are very blue, in case you haven't ever taken a really close look. They've got yellow in them, and they're blue, and it's a really tricky color, and I think the chalkiness of the Cobalt Teal actually makes a big difference in painting them. Another great thing about daffodils is deer don't eat your daffodils. And that's a very big problem here in the woods. All right, so I'm back to the little bit of Cobalt Teal with the Azo Yellow. So that's a translucent color leaf. It wouldn't mix quite as well with the cadmium for the bulk of the leaves. There's some of the cadmium in there, but mostly I don't want the orangey tone in the leaves because they don't really have a brown to them. They're more chalky blues, yellows. And most leaves do have a slight brown to them, so that's something to always pay attention to. All leaves aren't the same green, which is why I really prefer to mix most of my greens. So this is really the central flower. If there is some flowers, it's kind of a Hogarth curve arrangement. And of course I played with that because the actual daffodils weren't quite so nice as to get exactly where I wanted them. So this is the flower that has most of the detail and most importantly has the greatest contrast between light and dark. So I'm saving my bold contrast for this flower, and there's going to be a touch on the facing page, the large flower facing towards me there, but most of it's here. So striations in the petals and pulling in some of that color because the flowers are very translucent. Now notice how the cadmium yellow on top of the Azo Yellow has a very different effect. And you can see all those greens right through the flowers. Blurring the edges and leaving areas of the pure Azo Yellow too. It's just gorgeous. I love backlit flowers. Okay, popping some darks. Have that cobalt violet. And on location, it's bound to be a little bit more heavy-handed than in the studio because you don't have layers and layers to develop something. But you have the immediate emphasis of the light changing and actually being out there and fully experiencing what you're painting. Which, is there a better way to experience spring than going and painting it? I don't think so. It fixes in your mind. Each spring is so special. We only have so many of them. And to be able to sit down and paint your life as it happens, and then next January think the daffodils are coming again soon. Some fun splatter. A little bit more emphasis on that dark. I want that cone to come, there to be some definite depth in the cone, but the petals not as interested in. When everything's gray, there's going to be daffodils blooming in your journal. And it's just going to be a lovely sight. It's so tempting to go and rim that with darks, but there's only so much detail I want there and only so much contrast. Just a little bit of Quin Rust there, and I'm done. Here's the finished daffodils. I hope this inspires you to go paint some daffodils or whatever's blooming in your area. For more information, visit my website, paintingwatercolor.com. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting!